Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning for the one joining us from Europe. My name is Tracy Wong Harris, Deputy Secretary General of the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. It's my absolute pleasure to be your MC this afternoon at the Hong Kong Green Finance 2020 Annual Forum. This morning's sessions, we have heard from top officials and expert speakers sharing on the importance of financing a green and inclusive recovery in the region and specific projects in the Greater Bay Area. For this afternoon, we have exciting lines up starting with this year's Hong Kong GFA report release, followed by keynotes from Ashley Elder, CEO of Security Future Commissions Hong Kong. From 3 p.m., we will have two panels joined by experts around the world sharing the latest green and sustainable finance product developments and discuss the burning question of climate transition finance. Before we start, let me highlight some important housekeeping. On the right-hand side of your screen right now, you should see some tabs. The Q&A tab, I encourage you all to post questions. And for the live polling tab, this will pop up when the moderator starts the polling questions. The agenda tab will allow you to go to the HKGFA Forum page, which will have all the details about today's events. Lastly, for the chat room function, if you have signed up when you RSVP, you should see this function. And do feel free to use this function to network with other participants throughout the event. Without further ado, let me start with the first report release on green building. Okay, so the Green Building Project is a collaboration between the Hong Kong 2050 is now, and as this morning's seminar mentioned, is part of the Greater Bay Green Finance Alliance platform. For those who joined last year's HKGFA 2019 Forum, you might remember we announced the birth of the Green Building Project. So 1 year on, I'm delighted to be here sharing two research reports' key findings today. The two reports' executive summary will be available on the HKGFA website and the 2050 website later on today, and the full report will be released on the 8th of December. Before I share the key findings from the two reports, I would like to highlight the goal of the Green Building Project is to decarbonize the building sector in the GBA and to maximize the green and sustainable finance opportunities. Taking Hong Kong as an example, the building sector contributes to over 90% of electricity, which is over 60% of the total carbon emissions in Hong Kong. The 2050 report highlights the building sector is the #2 biggest carbon emitter and will need to remove 11 million tons of CO2 in order to achieve net zero. On top of that, it was estimated that 13% of embodied carbon from building construction is not currently being accounted for. With that, we have conducted two studies. The first report, the Green Building Rating System Energy Benchmarking Study, which examined 8 existing green building rating systems with the purpose to answer two simple questions. One, what is the energy components percentage from each of these rating systems towards the overall certification? Secondly, whether the existing green building rating system sufficiently facilitate the decarbonization in the building sector. The 8 green building rating systems that we studied are the China Green Building Label, BREEAM, which is from UK, Green Star from Australia, LEED from US, BEAM Plus, which is our Hong Kong local rating system, EDGE from IFC, Green Mark from Singapore, and also Neighbours from Australia. There are 7 key findings from the benchmarking report. When we look at the overall energy aspect of each of these rating systems, we have found that the 2 performance-based rating systems, EDGE and Neighbours, so on the graph, you can see on the far right-hand side, they contribute to the most significant overall energy aspect towards the overall certifications between 33 to 100%. Number 2, energy saving requirements. Only 2 rating systems, H and Green Star, recognize 100% energy saving, and LEED recognize 50%. Renewable energy. Less than half of the rating system accept both off-site renewable energy, like green power, RECs, and carbon mitigation projects. And incentives are the key driver for green building rating system to scale up. Taking Hong Kong as an example, since the rollout of the gross floor area concession incentive, around 60% of the new buildings have applied for Green Plus assessment, and more than 95% of the projects have applied for the GFA concessions. And in Singapore, they provide the financial incentive on retrofitting, which can be used as a case study for Hong Kong. Actual energy performance data is lacking in Hong Kong, as the ongoing monitoring and data disclosure are not prerequisite as part of the rating system certification. For existing building, actual operational energy performance data should be used to measure the accuracy of energy efficiency achieved for certification. And lastly, we have identified opportunities for local rating system, BIM Plus, in order for the local rating system to further market coverage and to attract international investors. With this, the second report, the Building Policy Decarbonizations report, which conducted an in-depth study looking at Hong Kong's current policy environment, including building energy code, incentive subsidies, and evaluation of the approach taken in other jurisdictions like Singapore, mainland China, United Kingdom, Australia, and Europe. The reports point out the building sector-specific roadmap must be developed, which outline 4 key steps that will be required to achieve net zero by 2050. First, improvement in regulatory tools like upgrading our existing building energy code, mandatory energy efficiency label scheme, upgrade energy audit code to be more frequent than currently set at 10 years, and also to review building envelope requirement and mandate public disclosure and rating of energy data. Incentivize the market, upgrading the current gross floor concession scheme to tie to energy efficiency requirements. Implement public-private partnership to improve the energy efficiency of existing building, and also to participate in emission tradings and mandate corporate disclosure. Step 3, we also found that influencing behavioral change is very important. For example, by carbon tax or increased renewable energy generation. Lastly, public sector procurement. Implement potential decarbonization strategy on public projects and establish a dedicated cross-agency body to implement the decarbonization roadmap. As mentioned earlier, the full report will be released on the 8th of December, and the summary, the key highlights, will be available on our website later on today. With that, I would like to express my sincere thank you to the project team from CSAP and Arab and all the individuals contributing to these 2 reports, and a heartfelt thank you to Dr. Ma Jun and Lisa Genasi for their guidance and for throughout the whole green building project. And finally, funding from RS Group make this study possible. So thank you all. With this, the next step, we will be conducting pilot projects by working with property owner, financial institution, and certifier, leveraging innovative green finance to address some of these gaps we identify in this report. So do reach out to me if you would like to be part of these exciting green building projects. Thank you. Okay, so our second report release is also a collaboration with the Hong Kong 2050 is Now platform, where the HKGFA Green Bond Working Group members contribute greatly on the burning topic of climate transition finance. Let me introduce our very own Green Fairy, Chaoni Huang, Vice President and Secretary General of Hong Kong Green Finance Association, Executive Director, Head of Sustainable Capital Market, Global Market APAC, BNP Paribas. Chaoni.
Thank you, Tracy. Did not know I was a green fairy until just now. Thank you very much. So as Tracy mentioned, it is a burning topic. And if we think about, the Paris Agreement ambition, if we are to achieve it, it's going to need a tremendous amount of capital for the transformation. And in response to immense, financing needs, we have seen green and climate finance created to facilitate such capital allocation towards activities, technologies, and assets that contribute significantly to the transition to a climate-resilient economy. While these are very critical, we think there's a mixing gap here. We need new tools going forward, particularly for industries that are historically high emitting or that face constraints to decarbonize, and they might not have access to the green and climate finance market that is very vibrant right now. For example, sorry, need to use the slides. So for example, the steel and cement sector, you can see on the slides here that, they are fundamental to our economy, and they continue to be fundamental to our economy. And the production of steel and cement, each responsible for roughly 8% of CO2 emissions, globally. And China is responsible for more than half the world's production. So while they are very high emitting today, they are still a key contribution to make the fight against climate change. And arguably, they can bring the biggest delta in reducing our climate impact. So to capture this financing need, a new climate transition finance label is emerging to cover sectors and activities that might not be able to become entirely green today, but where partially satisfactory improvements will be instrumental for a net zero world. Thus, clarity on the definition of climate transition finance will facilitate purposeful capital towards these needs. So with this paper, Navigating Climate Transition Finance, our aim is to create a framework for what we believe are important principles that market authorities and market participants should consider in defining an operational structure for climate transition activities, particularly in China and in Hong Kong SAR. At the same time, with global efforts shaping the climate transition finance concept, we would like to contribute towards such discussion with our regional perspectives to create more clarity and convergence. So how do we do this? Well, let's start with 5 steps that we think are fairly easy to adopt, particularly in relation to the matured, green bond market. So if you look at these 5 steps, they really correspond to, the common requirements that we had seen in, for example, Green ICMA Green Bond Principles, Green Loan Principles, and EU Green Bond Standards. So first of all, eligibility. We need to define eligible use of proceeds categories and criteria. And in the report, we have used steel, cement, and energy as sector examples to showcase possible use of proceeds in transitioning, these high-impact sectors. Secondly is the process for project selection and evaluation. Thirdly, management of proceeds. These are common pillars that you see in green bonds. So I wouldn't, spend too much time on them. Fourthly, reporting. Transparency is always, one of the best policies to safeguard the market for investors to have access to information, to understand where the allocation goes and the impacts created. And fifthly is the external review. But it doesn't stop here. We think, for the transition finance label, we need to have extra steps or extra explanation to contextualize the importance or the meanings of transition. So if you look at here, we have laid out 5 areas where issuers or borrowers need to provide sufficient information to investors as well as other key stakeholders about their transition plan. Contextualization is critical here, and let me emphasize again, which is key differentiation to the commonly seen, green bonds. So first of all, explain credible mid and long-term plan to align with Paris Agreement. These plans might include, for example, capex shift, revenue shift, as well as evidence that these things are in motion. China's real economy borrowers would have to set at least the same reduction targets as China's 2016 NDC, or higher given China's recent new pledge for carbon neutrality by 2060. And there are existing science-based tools such as Science-Based Target Initiative, Climate Bond Initiative, and Transition Pathway initiative for borrowers and issuers to utilize to set their midterm and long-term decarbonization target. Secondly, is to explain the constraints that you are facing, given the sectors, geographies, materials, or technology, and provide evidence to support these arguments. And actors should be transparent in explaining what, why, and how constraints prevent them from adopting low-carbon alternatives. And this is where contextualization comes in evidently. For example, the discussion related to developing country versus developed country. These are very important information for investors to consider the credibility of your transition plan. Thirdly, is to explain the partially satisfactory technologies and the activities that are considered eligible for the climate transition financing. Examples of useful information includes emission reduction targets expected from these partially satisfactory technologies and activities, and benchmarking against target decarbonization trajectory, credibility of the technology and activity in the context of the country's operation. Fourthly, is explain the measure in place to ensure operations, activities and investment do no significant harms for non-climate objectives, including social dimension, and propose a do least harm strategy for when the partial technology and activities are deployed. Fifthly, and this is where I want to emphasize, is the ability to explain a deliberate phase-out plan for these partially satisfactory technologies and activities in order to make way for net zero compatible technology and activities. So we are not, getting into a situation with carbon locking or extending, the life of high carbon intensive, assets. So borrowers and issuers who use climate transition finance for these partially satisfactory technologies must not hamper the development and deployment of low-carbon alternatives. So they must plan to replace these technologies for a more net zero compatible once the constraints ease. These can mean setting aside a decommissioning fund for replacement, using local and regional decarbonization trajectory as an important reference. So what are the implications? We map out the implication on companies, banks, insurers, investors, and external reviewers. In the interest of time, I want to emphasize that corporates, from these high-emitting sectors need to future-proof their business by investing heavily on R&D in development of new low-carbon technologies, methods, and practices, because it's just too important. We do not have a lot of time for you to transition slowly. As I said, phasing out alignment to meet and long-term Paris Agreement is critical to make the transition label credible. So for banks, who are very important player in the sector, certainly, we see them using their lending policies as well as structuring advisor role in these deals would have a direct impact on the credibility of the market. So I would encourage, banks, when they are acting as structuring advisors in transition finance, it's important to provide issuers with professional and impartial advice to uphold the integrity of green credentials in a transition finance deal. For insurers, investors, you all play a very key role in risk-taking, in supporting them, in the transition. So your appetite towards transition finance, towards impact expectation will be critical in supporting the growth of this market. Finally, external reviewer, we will rely on their independent judgment to provide that assessment and validation of the transition credibility. And a final point, given transition is a dynamic process rather than static, we believe issuance activity-based assessment is more valid than a framework-based approach. So my final words is to really thank the project teams, the individuals and members mentioned on this slide. Without their tireless support and input, this paper wouldn't be possible. So I hope you find our research finding useful as a way to support the market development. The report will be available on Hong Kong GFA website shortly after the conference. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Chaoni. The final report release item for the sessions will be presented by Alan Lam, Senior Advisor, Environmental Finance, WWF-Hong Kong, Liu Yingquan, Head of Sustainable Bond Debt Capital Market, Asia Pacific, HSBC. They will be presenting the Hong Kong Green and Sustainable Finance Survey result. Over to you, Alan and Liu Ying.
Thank you, Tracy. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the last report release of today's HKGFA Annual Forum. My name is Alan Lam, Senior Advisor of Environmental Finance of WWF-Hong Kong. And next to me is Ms. Liu Yinggang, Head of Sustainable Bonds Asia Pacific from HSBC. Since the first green bond was issued in Hong Kong 5 years ago, the local green finance market has evolved tremendously with different incentives and policies implemented to attract a diversified pool of issuers and investors of green bonds. The HKGFA has launched a Green and Sustainable Finance Survey in September to solicit opinions from market participants and stakeholders on their thoughts of the state of the market, opportunities and barriers, as well as key drivers to further develop Hong Kong as a leading green and sustainable finance centre. So the survey has focused on 5 different areas, including market drivers, opportunities and barriers, the Green Bond Grant Scheme, beyond green and sustainable bonds, and finally, the key to further develop the market and maintain Hong Kong's competitiveness as a leading green and sustainable finance hub. The survey has gathered opinions from over 100 participants across almost 20 industries, mostly located in Hong Kong. The report we have launched, with key results to be presented shortly, represent views from the stakeholders of the Hong Kong green and sustainable finance market, with the majority being service providers, book runners, and investors.
As you may be aware, Hong Kong has already got a sufficient amount of green finance activities. As at year-end 2019, there are over 26 billion of green bonds which are arranged and issued in Hong Kong. When we ask about what makes Hong Kong a leading green and sustainable finance hub, government leadership actually topped our survey respondents' choice, followed by financial incentives such as the Green Bond Grant Scheme. Infrastructure and professionals as part of the sustainable finance ecosystem are also considered very important. We then continue to ask our issuer respondents what their consideration of issuing sustainable bonds in Hong Kong. Having sufficient sustainable finance projects come as the #1 consideration, followed by positive investor impact such as diversifying investor base as well as increasing investor loyalty. Availability of internal expertise and pricing benefits are also high up in the issuer's consideration. Moving on to the next slide, we move to the buy side. When our investor respondents are asked about their consideration of making sustainable bond investments, credit rating of the issuer, potential environmental and social impact of the project, and what kind of certification obtained or standard aligned are the top factors. What surprised us a little bit is the transparency and disclosure commitment, as well as the risk and return dynamic of sustainable bonds actually seem to be lower in the priority ranking. We also asked our issuer the reason of not issuing a green bond in Hong Kong so far. The top choices turn out to be the lack of sufficient infrastructure to support green bond issuance and trading. So hopefully the Hong Kong Stock Exchange recent announcement about setting up the dedicated segment for sustainable bonds will help ease this obstacle.
Locally, we have seen various initiatives led by the policymakers and regulatory bodies in Hong Kong. For example, the Green Bond Grant Scheme that's led by the FSTB that will benefit issuers in Hong Kong. We have observed one of the major drivers for issuers not applying for the Green Bond Grant Scheme was because they did not meet one of the eligibilities as stipulated of the scheme. For example, the choice of external reviewer, size of the issuance, and listing and arranging of the location, meaning Hong Kong. Based on the feedback from the survey participants and current scope of the Green Bond Grant Scheme, the government may explore the possibility of the expansion of the eligibility for the current Green Bond Grant Scheme to include any external reviews done based on internationally or recognized or regionally recognized principles, standards, taxonomies, and frameworks. Another feedback from participants is the scope of the grant scheme, which is currently limiting to bonds only. Expanding the grant scheme to cover other products such as green or sustainability-linked loans or bonds, social sustainability, and even transition bonds on top of green bonds will have been a popular vote. And when we ask participants how do they think the GBGS can actually improve. Beyond green and sustainable bonds, the availability of a comprehensive ecosystem of green finance products and infrastructure, economic benefits such as tax incentives, and regulatory frameworks will be vital for Hong Kong to develop as an international green and sustainable finance center. According to the survey participants, almost 3/3 of the participants believe that a local green social sustainability taxonomy or some sort of standards or guideline locally is required for Hong Kong and the region. Looking further into this actual very high percentage, we conclude from the further remarks made by the many participants that whilst a uniform approach that can help set clear baseline for the classification and best practices in sustainable finance for Hong Kong and the region, these standards or taxonomy should not be reinvented. Instead, they should align to the common design of the existing taxonomies or standards that is sufficiently localized for key sectors to guide Hong Kong to transit into a low-carbon city. As part of the regulatory support as well, as mentioned already by Liu Ying, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange will launch the Sustainable and Green Exchange, or what we call STAGE, by the end of 2020 in Hong Kong, aiming to provide greater information, access, and transparency on a wide range of sustainable, green, and social investment products. Most, if not all, survey participants strongly believe that they will benefit from STAGE by the availability of accessible, transparent, and reliable information on the portal. Again, transparency is the key.
The last section of the survey are open questions, which give the participant the opportunity to share views on what is their expectation on the newly established Green and Sustainable Finance Cross-Agency Steering Groups. Respondents expect there would be enhanced public and private partnership to raise awareness, promote products, enhance transparency and disclosure, and sustainability indexes are particularly mentioned here. Other respondents believe that developing the green investor base in Asia would be key. And financial incentives such as tax breaks are also mentioned a couple of times. Today, we are here to celebrate the second anniversary of Hong Kong GFA. We are also here to discuss how to make the further development of Hong Kong as a sustainable finance hub. Our survey respondents actually gave us some great ideas. For example, to work with regional and international financial markets to create tools, standards, and opportunities. Enhancement of ESG data availability is actually asked by both issuers and investors. Launching more sustainable finance products to the retail markets, and financial incentive to further promote take-up, all reflect market participants' hope and wish for this market to develop its depth and width in the coming years. In the year of 2020, at the backdrop of the unprecedented pandemic as well as climate challenge, sustainable development has become a strategic priority for governments, financial organizations, and corporates and individuals like you and me. So I think hopefully let's work closely together to advance the sustainable finance journey. Thank you so much for joining us today, but please do stay with us for your future sustainable finance need and your journey. Thank you.
Thank you.